The fog had not yet lifted from the Seine when Inspector Maigret stepped into the narrow lane behind Rue des Récollets. The city was half asleep, its windows grey with condensation, its silence broken only by the slow trickle of water into a gutter. Somewhere a milk cart rattled, somewhere a clock chimed 6, and in a forgotten courtyard behind an old lodging house, a staircase glistened darkly beneath the flickering glow of a kerosene lamp. Blood, thin, diluted by rain, had begun to slide down each worn step, pooling against the uneven cobblestones. A woman's shoe lay nearby, one heel snapped clean off. Maigret did not speak. He simply drew on his pipe, watching the smoke drift into the mist, as though trying to coax the morning itself into confession. The caretaker trembled beside him, muttering about a scream in the night, about footsteps that had vanished before dawn. But Maigret knew the silence of murder. It was not loud or violent. It was the kind that seeped into walls and lingered in the air, like damp tobacco. If you find yourself drawn into these silent Parisian mysteries, into the glow of café lamps and the whispers that float across the Seine, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, share the story, and step once more into Maigret's world, where truth hides in shadows and the simplest clue can undo an entire life. The morning was the colour of watered milk. A low mist clung to the stone facades, softening the lines of the buildings and dulling the first light of day. Maigret walked slowly through the narrow passage leading to the courtyard, his overcoat collar turned up, his hat tilted against the drizzle. There was a faint smell of kerosene and damp plaster, of last night's rain mingling with soot and iron. Somewhere nearby, a cafe owner was unlocking his shutters. The sound echoed faintly, swallowed by the fog. The courtyard revealed itself like a memory returning in fragments. A rectangular hollow enclosed by aging walls, a broken drainpipe, a clutter of bicycles and crates stacked near the cellar door. The staircase rose along the wall opposite, its steps slick with moisture, the railing rusted. A single gas lamp, left burning through the night, flickered weakly above it, throwing light in uncertain patterns. At the foot of the stairs the blood had begun to spread. It was thin now, carried outward by the drizzle, streaking the cobblestones like veins. A pale shoe rested a few feet away, the kind sold cheaply in the markets near Saint-Denis, its strap torn loose. Maigret stood still for a long time, the smoke from his pipe blending with the mist. Janvier was speaking quietly to the caretaker, a thin man in an oversized wool coat, his hands twisting a cap as if trying to strangle his own nerves. He claimed to have heard a scream a little after 2 in the morning, followed by hurried steps descending the staircase. By the time he'd reached his door, the courtyard was empty, the night silent again. He hadn't dared to look until dawn when he saw the blood. He swore that the tenants upstairs had all been asleep, but his eyes darted toward the 3rd floor each time he spoke. Maigret listened without interruption. He had learned that words changed shape when left alone long enough. Truth often revealed itself not in what was said, but in how silence gathered after it. He gestured to Janvier to make a note of the tenants' names, then began to climb the stairs, one hand brushing the damp railing. Each step made a hollow sound, and he paused at the landing, glancing into the shadows where the blood trail ended. It was faint, but visible. A dark handprint near the door of the 2nd floor flat. He knocked gently. No answer. The door was locked, and no light seeped from within. Behind him, the caretaker muttered that the room was rented by a woman, alone, quiet, rarely seen. A sewing machine could sometimes be heard late into the night. He didn't know her name. The rent had always been paid on time, in cash, by post. She had moved in about 6 months ago, bringing with her only a small suitcase and a framed photograph she kept on the mantel. Maigrè's pipe had gone out. He struck a match and relit it, the brief flare illuminating his face, heavy-lidded eyes, patient expression, the faintest hint of weariness that never seemed to leave him. "We'll need the locksmith," he said quietly. "But not yet. Let her have her peace a little longer." There was no urgency in his tone, only an odd tenderness, as if he were reluctant to disturb something fragile. From above came the creak of a shutter. A woman's voice called down, sharp with curiosity, asking what had happened. Another window opened, then another. Soon the courtyard filled with the murmurs of half-dressed tenants, leaning out to sea. Maigret didn't look up. He knew the rhythm of these moments, the city awakening to someone else's tragedy, the thrill of it passing like a gust through every stairwell. By noon, the neighborhood would hum with stories, none of them true, yet all of them necessary to fill the space left by the unknown. A policeman returned from the street carrying a coat found near the alley gate, dark wool, torn at the shoulder, stained with blood. Maigret took it without comment, his fingers running along the lining. Inside the pocket, he found a scrap of paper folded twice. It was blank, except for a faint smudge, perhaps from a pencil rubbed out. He slipped it into his notebook, then stared once more at the staircase. A cat emerged from behind the bins, moving with careful disdain, its paws avoiding the wet patches. It sniffed the air, arched its back, then vanished through a broken window near the cellar. Life, indifferent, continued. Janvier returned with a list of tenants, a piano teacher, a retired postman, a young couple with a child, a traveling salesman who rented by the week, and the woman on the second floor, no first name given, only Mademoiselle B in the caretaker's register. The handwriting there was faint, as if pressed lightly by someone unused to such formalities. "Send Lucas to the prefecture," Maigret said. "Have them check for missing persons in the last month. Women, mid-20s, dark hair." He paused. "And have someone talk to the neighbors on Rue de la Fidélité. The noise would have carried." As he spoke, he noticed something glinting beneath the lowest step, a fragment of glass. He bent down, lifted it carefully. It was part of a bottle, the label mostly gone, but the scent that lingered was unmistakable, cheap perfume, strong, floral, clinging to the fingers like smoke. He pocketed it. Perfume had a way of lingering longer than people, of marking rooms, of betraying secrets even the dead tried to keep. The sound of a train whistle drifted from the Gare de l'Est. Maigret raised his head, listening to it fade. The city was stirring now, carts rolling, shutters banging open, the air thick with coal dust and morning chatter. Soon the courtyard would fill with policemen, photographers, clerks with ledgers and tags. But for now, it was his alone, this quiet theatre of crime. He lit his pipe again and looked up at the window of Mademoiselle B.'s room. The curtains were drawn, but he could almost feel the presence behind them. Absence has a weight of its own, heavier than flesh. There was something about the stillness of that space that told him the story had not begun with violence. It had begun with fear. Fear leaves traces more delicate than blood, invisible until you know how to see them. A voice from the gate called his name. It was a boy, one of the errand runners from the market, clutching a telegram addressed to the police. Maigret took it, tore it open. The message was brief. Possible identification. Woman seen 2 nights ago at Café du Nord. With man carrying black umbrella. No signature. No address. The inspector's eyes narrowed slightly. The morning, once heavy with silence, began to breathe again. The umbrella, always a small, ordinary detail, had appeared too soon to be coincidence. He said nothing, only drew deeper on his pipe. The smoke curled upward in slow spirals, merging with the fog, until it seemed that both man and city exhaled the same weary sigh. He turned to Janvier. "Let's pay a visit to the Café du Nord," he said quietly. "But first, send for the doctor. I don't like leaving her alone any longer." The caretaker crossed himself. Somewhere a church bell began to toll the hour, its sound drifting through the alleys like a benediction over the dead. Maigret stood for a moment longer on the landing, his coat damp, his pipe nearly spent, his thoughts already several streets ahead, tracing a path from the courtyard's blood-stained stones to the heart of a city that hid its truths beneath the ordinary. He descended the steps slowly, each footfall echoing in the morning air, as if the staircase itself were remembering. Behind him, the flickering lamp gave one last shudder and went out. The courtyard sank back into its silence, keeping its secret for just a little longer. The morgue smelled faintly of damp linen and carbolic acid. The air was cold enough to make Maigret's breath visible, though he barely noticed it. He had always disliked this place, not for its darkness, but for its quiet efficiency, the way death here was reduced to tags and ledgers, bodies lined neatly like unclaimed luggage. A clerk in a white coat guided him to the far table, his voice low, respectful, yet perfunctory. "Brought in this morning from Rue des Récollets." No identification. The sheet was lifted. Maigret leaned forward slightly. The woman's face was pale, waxen, but peaceful in a way that unsettled him. Death had not distorted her features. It had merely removed their tension. She was perhaps 28, maybe 30. Dark hair pinned loosely. The faintest crease between the brows, a trace of habitual worry. Her hands were small, neatly kept, with a faint line of callus along the right thumb, as if from needlework. He studied her quietly for a long time. Her clothes, a navy dress, clean but worn, had been carefully mended. The buttons were mismatched, the collar yellowed from use. No jewelry, no papers, no scars except a small one near the wrist, long-heeled. Whoever she was, she had lived carefully, perhaps modestly, the kind of life that leaves few traces but endless fatigue. "Nothing on her?" Maigret asked. The clerk shook his head. "Only this." He produced a handkerchief from a sealed envelope. It was white, embroidered with a single letter, B, in blue thread, almost faded. Maigret turned it in his hands. The letter could have stood for anything, a first name, a surname, or merely a memory. He placed it back in the envelope and slipped it into his pocket. He moved toward the window, the pale light filtering through frosted glass. Outside, the fog had begun to lift. The faint outline of the Seine was visible, a moving ribbon of grey. Maigret watched it absently, pipe in hand, though he didn't light it. "No one's come to claim her?" "Not yet," the clerk replied. "We'll have her listed by noon. The newspapers usually take notice." Maigret nodded. He knew the process. By evening, the Petit Parisien would carry a small column, "Unidentified woman, found dead in courtyard." The words would be cold, precise, and by tomorrow, half of Paris would believe they knew her. A dozen callers would arrive at the morgue, each certain she resembled someone they once knew, each story ending in disappointment. Sometimes truth emerged that way, by mistake. He left the morgue without another word. Outside, the city was waking fully. A line of carriages moved along the embankment. Children in wool caps hurried to school. A newspaper vendor shouted headlines about a strike in Lyon. The ordinary rhythm of life continued, indifferent to the silent woman who had died behind the boarding-house staircase. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret's office was already busy. Lucas was waiting, coat still wet from the rain, holding a folder. "Report from the Identification Bureau," he said. "No match yet, but there's something odd. 2 missing person notices filed last week by private citizens, both describing women of similar build and age. One from Montparnasse, one from Belleville." Maigret took the folder, flipping through the typed pages. The descriptions were vague. One woman, a shop assistant, the other a governess dismissed from service. Neither mentioned a scar on the wrist. He placed the papers aside. "Send someone to Belleville first," he said. "The shop assistant can wait. People in service disappear too easily, usually by choice." Lucas hesitated. "There's more. Café du Nord confirms she was there the night before last, with a man. Black umbrella, grey hat, heavyset, about 40. They drank coffee, spoke little. Left around 11. The waiter thought she looked frightened." Maigret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did she speak?" "Only once. Asked if the rain had stopped. That was all. Yet it was enough. A woman afraid, watching the weather, measuring the darkness outside before she stepped into it." Maigret leaned back in his chair, the wooden frame creaking. The pipe smoke rose in a slow curl toward the ceiling. "Fear has its own language," he murmured. "You don't need to shout to be heard." He rose and crossed to the map pinned to the wall. Small coloured pins marked other cases. Blue for solved, red for open. He placed a fresh one near Rue des Récollets, then traced a path to the Gare du Nord. "It's not far," he said quietly. "A few streets, a tram ride." She didn't come from the other side of the city. She was close enough to think she could still turn back. Janvier entered, a paper bag in his hand, the smell of coffee and croissants filling the room. "From Madau's," he said, setting it down. Maigret smiled faintly, though his eyes remained distant. Madau's Café on Rue de la Lappe was one of his quiet sources, a place where rumour mixed with truth, where faces could be seen twice without question. "Tell Madau to ask around," he said. "See if anyone's been talking about a girl from the Récollet district, someone who disappeared, someone who paid her rent too neatly." By noon, the fog had lifted entirely. Sunlight glinted on the river, turning it almost silver. Yet in Maigret's mind the courtyard remained. Damp, grey, eternal. Cases like this had a way of clinging, not because of horror, but because of ordinariness. There was nothing dramatic about her death, no theatrics. Just a staircase, a trickle of blood, and a name missing from every ledger. He lunched at a small bistro near Pont-Neuf, sitting alone, sipping wine while thinking of the embroidered. He had known so many such women, quiet lives dissolving into anonymity, their stories only pieced together when it was too late. Paris, for all its brilliance, devoured the lonely. In the afternoon, a call came from the Belleville precinct. A man had arrived insisting that the description in the paper fit someone he knew, a seamstress named Berthe Lambert. She rented a room near Rue des Pyrénées, had not been seen since Monday. The inspector listened without interruption, then rose, buttoning his coat. "Tell them I'm coming," he said. Belleville was louder, rougher, the streets filled with factory workers, children, and the smell of coal smoke. The house was easy to find, a narrow 3-story building leaning slightly to one side, its plaster cracked. The landlady, a stout woman with red hands, confirmed that Berthe had lived there for half a year. "Quiet girl," she said. "Paid her rent early. Went out in the evenings sometimes, but not for pleasure. Looked worried lately. Told me once she'd made a mistake and couldn't fix it." In the room, the bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn. A sewing machine sat near the window. On the mantel, a framed photograph of a woman older than the victim, perhaps a mother. Next to it, a small bottle of perfume lay uncorked. The smell was sharp, floral. Maigray's eyes lingered on it, the same scent he had found on the shard beneath the staircase. He turned to Janvier. "We've found her," he said quietly. "Berthe Lambert." It should have felt like progress, but it didn't. A name was only the beginning of a story, and he sensed this one would not end neatly. On the small table lay a postcard, half written and never sent. "Don't come back to Paris yet. Things are not as they were. I'll explain soon." The rest of the line had been crossed out violently, as if in regret. Maigret pocketed the card. Outside, the street noise pressed in. Carts rolling, a child crying, the faint music from a radio somewhere. Life went on as it always did, indifferent to private tragedies. He looked once more at the empty room, the dust motes drifting in sunlight. It was as though the woman had stepped out just moments before, leaving her presence folded neatly among her things. When they left, the landlady was waiting by the door, wringing her hands. "Will they write about her?" she asked. "Perhaps," Maigret said, "but they won't understand her." He adjusted his hat, lit his pipe, and began the walk back down the hill. The afternoon light was already fading, and the first chill of evening crept into the air. Somewhere ahead lay the man with the umbrella, the one who had shared her last coffee, the one who had watched her hesitate before stepping into the rain. Maigret drew deeply on his pipe. The smoke drifted upward, slow and thoughtful. In his mind, the pieces began to arrange themselves. A woman afraid, a man who waited, a courtyard that kept its silence. And, beneath it all, the faint, persistent question that haunted him through every case. Was it pity or guilt that drove people to their final moments? The city offered no answer. Only the rhythm of its footsteps, the hum of its distant trains, and the faint echo of a name, Berthe, fading into the evening fog. The rain had returned by evening, a soft drizzle that turned the courtyard into a mirror of glistening stone. Gaslight shimmered in puddles, and the air smelled faintly of soot and damp plaster. Inside the lodging house, the stairwell echoed with the heavy boots of policemen moving up and down, their voices low, their steps careful. It was the kind of place that swallowed sound, where every whisper seemed to cling to the walls. Maigret stood near the entrance, hat in hand, pipe unlit. He preferred to move slowly in places like this, not to startle, not to command, but to listen. Each tenant, he knew, would speak differently, some out of fear, some out of vanity, others out of a need to belong to something larger than their small lives. He had met them all before, in one form or another, in rooms that smelled of boiled cabbage and old wallpaper. The first to speak was the piano teacher from the second floor, Monsieur Lavorel, a thin man with watery eyes and a tremor in his hands that made the cuffs of his shirt flutter. He opened the door before Maigret could knock, as if he'd been waiting. "I heard nothing," he said quickly. "Nothing at all. I go to bed early. My hearing isn't what it used to be." His room was tidy but airless, filled with the faint odour of varnish and loneliness. A metronome sat motionless on the piano, a small crucifix above it. Maigret asked a few polite questions, but Lavorel's answers came rehearsed, like a man who had practised his innocence. When Maigret thanked him and turned to leave, the man suddenly asked, "Do you think it was her, the one who lived below me?" "We'll know soon enough," Maigret said. Lavorel hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the corridor. "She used to sing sometimes, quietly, nothing cheerful." In the next room lived a retired postman named Grosjean, his belly pressing against a worn waistcoat. The man seemed eager for conversation, though his words were cluttered with self-importance. "I told the constable already. I didn't hear the scream myself, but my wife did. Sharp, like a cat yowling. She woke me, and I went to the window. The courtyard was dark. I thought it was the neighbours again." He paused, lowering his voice. "People here mind their own business. It's better that way. You start asking questions, you make enemies." Maigret nodded, not because he agreed, but because he understood. Life in boarding houses depended on silence. People shared walls, but not truths. Each door was a boundary, each landing a truce. At the top of the stairs, a young woman waited, arms crossed. She couldn't have been more than 25, her hair tied back, hastily, a cigarette burning between her fingers. She introduced herself as Yvonne, the salesgirl who rented the smallest attic room. "You're wasting your time," she said bluntly. "Whoever killed her didn't live here. You think any of us could afford to be that dramatic?" Her laugh was dry, edged with something close to bitterness. She was nice enough, though, always polite. Never said much. Sometimes she'd sit on the step outside her door when it was too hot to sleep. Smoked cheap cigarettes. I think she had someone, a man. Not often, but once or twice I heard a knock late at night. Different footsteps than hers. "Did you see him?" Maigret asked. "Once, maybe twice, never clearly. Big shoulders, wore a hat. Walked like he belonged everywhere he went." She looked at him then, meeting his gaze without flinching. The kind of man you'd remember even if you tried to forget. Maigret studied her a moment. Did she seem frightened? Yvonne exhaled smoke. Maybe. Or maybe she was just tired. Around here it's the same thing. When she closed her door, the corridor felt smaller. Janvier joined him, notebook in hand. "No one admits to hearing anything before the scream," he said. But half of them were awake. The radio, the baby, the rain. Everyone's got their excuses. Maigret smiled faintly. "They're telling us what they think we want to hear. That's good. It means they're afraid of saying the wrong thing." He stopped at the second floor again, in front of the door to Berthe Lambert's room. The locksmith had already forced it open earlier that day, and now the room lay in quiet disarray. Drawers pulled, sheets folded back, an air of intrusion hanging like smoke. The sewing machine sat idle near the window, a half-finished dress draped over it. On the table, an empty teacup, a folded newspaper, and a stub of pencil. Nothing remarkable, yet everything perfectly arranged, as if she'd paused mid-thought and never returned. He walked slowly, his fingers tracing the back of a wooden chair. In the corner, a small trunk had been pried open. Inside, a few blouses, a coat, and a small packet tied with string. He untied it carefully. Inside was a photograph, creased and fading, Berthe, younger, standing beside a man in a railway uniform. The kind of man who smiled too confidently for the camera, his arm resting possessively around her shoulders. On the back, a note in her handwriting, André, 1928. Maigret slipped the photograph into his pocket. The air in the room felt heavy, the kind of stillness that lingers after too much waiting. He turned toward the window. Outside, the courtyard was a blur of reflections, rain pooling in the same place where the blood had been hours earlier. The city moved beyond, unaware. A knock came at the door. Lucas entered, hat dripping. "We found the umbrella," he said. Behind the bins near the alley gate, black silk, handle cracked. A tailor's mark from a shop on Boulevard Magenta. Maigret took it, feeling the weight. Ordinary, unremarkable. But inside its ferrule was a faint stain of something dark, like old mud. "Have it tested," he said, "and find out who bought it." As Lucas left, Maigret sat down at the sewing table. He lit his pipe, watching the smoke curl upward, tracing the outline of his thoughts. Everything here spoke of routine. A life measured in small gestures, in coins saved, in letters unsent. Yet beneath that order was a pulse of fear, quiet but insistent. He imagined Berthe sitting where he was now, sewing as the evening rain tapped at the window, glancing occasionally toward the door, waiting, perhaps listening for the sound of that knock she both dreaded and longed for. The world of the poor allowed little room for mistakes, and love, when it came, arrived as both gift and sentence. A movement outside caught his eye. Yvonne again, hurrying down the stairs, shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. She avoided looking up. Janvier called after her, but she didn't stop. Maigret watched in silence. "Let her go," he said. "Fear makes people move faster than guilt." When the night deepened, the police withdrew. The courtyard fell silent again. Only Maigret remained for a while longer, leaning against the doorframe, his eyes wandering across the small room. The city beyond had quieted, and the sound of dripping rain echoed through the empty stairwell. He felt a strange sadness, not for the dead woman alone, but for the entire house. For its faded wallpaper, its creaking boards, its tenants pretending not to hear each other through thin walls. It was a world built on modest lies, fragile as the thread that bound her last dress. Finally, he closed the door softly and descended the stairs. The gaslight near the landing buzzed faintly, the flame trembling with every draught. At the bottom, the caretaker dozed in a chair, hat pulled over his eyes. Maigret stepped past him without a word, the sound of his boots steady against the stones. The rain had nearly stopped, leaving the air heavy and sweet with the scent of wet leaves. Across the street, a cat darted into the shadows. Somewhere, a piano played faintly, a hesitant melody, one note repeated until it lost its meaning. Maigret paused at the gate, lighting his pipe once more. The flame flared briefly, illuminating his face, then vanished. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke dissolve into the damp air. The house behind him was dark again, its windows blind. Yet, in that darkness, he could feel the story deepening, layer by layer, like the city itself. Somewhere within these walls lay the truth, a woman who'd waited too long, a man who'd left too quickly, and neighbors who saw only what made their own lives easier to bear. He turned up his collar and walked toward the boulevard, his steps blending with the rhythm of distant carriages. In the puddles that lined the street, the gas lights shimmered like small suns, and behind them the shadow of the umbrella man seemed to linger, waiting, unseen, just beyond the reach of the rain. By morning, the rain had thinned to a fine mist that made the rooftops look powdered, as if the night had left a residue no daylight could scrub away. Maigret reached the lodging-house before the street had quite shaken off sleep. A milkman's cart rattled past, the horse snorting, a splash of white at its lips. Somewhere a door banged, and a woman scolded a child in a hushed voice. The courtyard stones were slick and dark, the staircase freshly washed, as though the caretaker believed cleanliness could erase memory. Maigret paused at the gate, drew once on his pipe, and climbed to the second floor with the deliberate, unhurried heaviness of a man already living 100 steps ahead of his feet. Inside Berthe Lambert's room, the air held a faint chill that spoke of rooms left alone too long. A policeman had opened the window to let the damp escape. The curtains stirred lightly, showing the world outside in brief cuts, the grey light, the parapet, a slice of neighbouring wall with its scabs of peeling paint. On the table Someone had left the items catalogued the night before, each tagged in a clerk's careful hand. The sewing machine's flywheel caught the light and shone briefly with something like life. Beneath it, the half-finished dress hung limp, a blue sleeve falling toward the floor like a tired gesture. He crossed to the iron stove and laid a palm on its cold flank. The door creaked softly under his fingers. Inside, ash lay in soft dunes, pale as flour, with darker islands where the fire had not finished its work. He crouched and, pipe clamped between his teeth, used the tip of a pencil to lift the ash by thin layers. It was slow work, and the room's silence folded around him like wool. A policeman shifted his weight near the door, and then stilled again, and the only sound left was the faint rasp of ash against iron. Halfway down, the pencil's point met resistance. Not bone, not metal, something that yielded reluctantly, fibrous and powdery by turns. He drew it up gently, and a corner of paper appeared, blackened but intact enough to show the barest edge of handwriting. He set it on the table, then returned for more, sifting patiently, until he had coaxed out several more fragments and the gelded ghost of a seal. Red wax, bubbled and cracked, with a smear of imprint that refused to resolve itself. He straightened, rubbed the ache from his knees, and blew softly across the largest piece. A single line emerged, brown ink gone fragile as old nerve. Plus venir, je t'en prie. Do not come any more, I beg you. His pipe had gone out again. He relit it slowly, watching the match flame draw colour from the air. He did not hurry the reconstruction. Pieces of a life resent being forced into order. On the table, he laid the fragments like small grey countries along a invisible border, tested edges, turned corners, trusted the instinct that had served him longer than any set of rules. A second line offered itself after a moment, the letters compromised but legible enough for meaning, si l'on apprend, if it is learned. The rest fell away into ash. The policeman hovered. "From her?" he asked. Maigret shook his head. The script was a man's, controlled, compressed, an office hand that had learned to hide feeling beneath neatness. He fished the red seal's bubbled remainder from the ashtray and held it near the window. The imprint was a suggestion only, yet the lower crescent of a letter showed through. D, or perhaps P. Paris, had too many of both. He sent the constable for Janvier and a sheet of clean paper, and when they came, he dictated what could be read without conjecture, each word with its margin of silence preserved. He did not trust reconstructions that filled gaps to make a story pleasant. Life was rarely that obliging. "Glue the fragments," he said, "but leave the blank spaces as blank spaces. Don't be clever." He turned again to the stove and in the very corner found a scrap no bigger than a stamp, inked on both sides. He set it aside deliberately, as one might do with a small coin kept for luck, and studied the room once more. A letter burned, and then hidden where heat dies, slowly is not the gesture of a person who believes she is finished. It is the gesture of someone who thinks she still has time to tidy up. He imagined Berthe kneeling where he had knelt, the poker in her hand, the smell of singed paper hitching her breath while rain tapped the window. If she had burned it in fear, what had she kept of it in memory? And what did she hope ash would keep from others? The caretaker appeared in the doorway with an air of news. "Monsieur Inspector," he said, swallowing, "I remembered something in the night. In the bin near the back gate, there was yesterday a handful of sealing wax, crushed. I threw it out with the ashes before the rain." "Show me the bin," Maigret said. They went down together. The courtyard seemed paler now, as if the morning had rubbed the night's bruise from the stones. In the bin, under damp paper and vegetable peels, he found what the caretaker had promised. Red crumbs lodged against the wood like a reluctant blush. He lifted a few and rolled them between finger and thumb. The wax softened, sticky still beneath its hard shell. Not old, then. Yesterday or the day before. He thought of the umbrella's cracked handle and the tailor's mark, of the man who had sat at the Café du Nord saying almost nothing while a woman watched the rain and chose not to run. Back upstairs, Janvier returned from the bureau with information from Boulevard Magenta. The umbrella had been repaired there 3 months earlier, the name given D. Perrin, paid in cash. Perrin? Janvier said. It could be anyone. There are 100 Perrins between here and the canal. 100, yes, Maigret said, and perhaps only one who writes a hand that wants to be invisible. He considered the red wax again, the half-letter in the seal. D or P. He remembered the carte de visite photographers near Strasbourg-Saint-Denis, the clerks with their little personal seals, the subheads at the freight office who liked their initials pressed in red. Men who lived small lives with orderly pockets where folded letters waited to be forgotten. He had the fragments carried carefully to the Quai des Orfèvres to be dried and mounted. For himself he kept the stamp-sized scrap and the faint tail of the seal, and in the afternoon he walked, as he liked to do when the case resisted sitting still. He walked the long way across to the canal where the towpath glistened, along the warehouses whose walls shed powder when brushed, past the low bridges where children leaned to stare at their own faces and laughed when ripples took them. The city under rain was not the same city as under sun. It softened, told the truth in smaller voices. At the post office on Rue du Faubourg Saint-Martin, he stopped and studied the pigeonholes, where unclaimed letters waited like quiet orphans. Names chalked on slates, initials above drawers, a careful order that soothed small minds. He asked to speak to the sub-director, an old acquaintance from other cases, and over a glass of something that tasted almost like coffee, he showed him the scrap of seal. The man turned it under the lamp and pursed his lips. "A private seal, common stock," he said. "The stationers near the Gare sell them, but this shade of red is particular. A lion wax appears like this when blotted quickly." "A man in a hurry, then," Maigret said mildly. "Or a man interrupted," the sub-director replied. He left him and crossed to the small stationer's where paper smelled as strongly of paper as a cellar smells of apples. The proprietor, dry as a drawer, nodded at the question before it was finished. "Yes, we sell that shade." To clerks, mostly. There was one last week who requested 3 sticks, same colour, same brand, moustache, grey hat, a high collar, though the day was warm. He had the air of a man who hates to be noticed. His name? The proprietor lifted a shoulder. He signed for nothing. But he asked for envelopes of a particular size. He produced one and laid it on the counter. It was slightly narrower than most, the kind a man uses when he wants to hide a letter among other papers, without bulk. "We sell them also to a freight agent on Rue des Vinaigriers. Perhaps he sent him." The freight agent, when found, smelled of rope and oil and the long patience of goods that move more slowly than desire. He knew nothing of wax, but when shown the envelope size, he smiled with recognition. "Ah, those. We use them for waybills to the provinces. And sometimes a certain Monsieur Perrin buys a packet, the very sort. Tall, heavy-set, grey hat. He likes to keep his receipts neat." "Does he work here?" "He works wherever paper accepts his handwriting. He is a second pair of hands for men who have too much to send and too little time. He comes and he goes. He is useful and therefore invisible." The word sat in Maigret's ear for a moment like a dropped coin. Invisible. He thanked the man, left him, and stood for a while on the bridge over the canal, watching a narrow boat slide beneath like a thought passing under a conversation. Grey hat, black umbrella, the habit of neutrality. A man who liked wax because it promised privacy and old-fashioned authority. A man who asked to be believed without question. He thought of Bertha's calluses, the careful mending of her collar, the postcard crossed out before she could write what she feared. A mistake she could not fix, she had told the landlady. If the letter in the stove begged her not to come any more, then she had already come too far. He returned to the Quai des Orfèvres and found Lucas waiting with the mounted fragments. The words were little more than islands in a mist, yet the current between them was strong enough to carry sense. Do not come any more. If it is learned, we shall both... Danger. Trust me. Money later. He touched the glass with a knuckle and felt the chill of it. The seal, enlarged by a Clark's lens, offered a firmer hint, not D after all, but the tail of R, a curve that promised a name beginning where another ended. Perrin did not fit, nor did the agent's list of regulars. But across the city, names changed hats as often as men did, and one might find a Perrin who signed himself R for Roland at the café, and for Robert at the office, and for no one at all when buying sticks of wax. Evening drew itself along the windows. The river outside looked like a strip of pewter. Maigret sat, pipe warm in his palm, and tried the letter's voice in his head. He gave it the man's hand he had pictured, precise, contained, afraid of smudges. It spoke not of passion, but of calculation, the kind of plea that inserts itself between two lines and expects to be obeyed because it does not shout, "Do not come any more." The imperative of a man who has something to lose and believes his fear should govern both lives. Yet she had come, or perhaps she had refused to go. The stove told him that much. It is not the grateful who burn letters, it is the angered and the ashamed. He rose, shrugged into his coat, and told Janvier to have the café on Rue de la Grange aux Belles watched from dusk. Not a raid, not a show of force, only eyes at a window and patience with a saucer of coffee. Watch for a grey hat that tilts because its owner wishes to shade his eyes, he said. Watch for a man who carries an umbrella even when there is no rain. The city outside had taken on that particular violet that comes just before gaslight acquires authority. He walked because walking was how his thoughts learned to keep step. Past the market where the last fishmongers hosed their boards, past a bookseller locking a stall on the quay with a chain whose links remembered other wrists, past a girl in a red shawl who laughed without merriment and counted coins carefully as if they could multiply under the right gaze. Paris presented its ordinary face, the one that allowed tragedy to look like routine. At the corner near the café he did not enter but stood across the street under a dripping awning. Through the glass he could see the inside, a zinc counter, mirrors smudged by breath, two labourers arguing softly about a losing horse, the waiter with his towel and his suspicion of conversation. No grey hat yet, only steam and the hiss of it, and the sound of a spoon rapping a cup as if to call someone up from sleep. He watched until the mirrors began to show fewer faces and the street's feet sounded fewer. Then he turned away, not disappointed, but certain that what needed to be seen would be seen when it chose to be. He slept briefly in his chair at the office, the coat over his shoulders, a hand still on the armrest, as if he were only pausing to listen more intently. Toward midnight a telegram arrived. The tailor on Boulevard Magenta recalled that the umbrella had not been bought by Perrin at all, only left in his name. Another man had brought it to repair, impatient, had joked about the weather, and left no joke in his eyes. He had spoken the name Perrin as one selects a card from a pack, thoughtfully, as if delighted by the lack of consequence. The tailor remembered because the man counted the coins twice before paying as exactly as scales. He was sure of one thing only. The man's voice betrayed the hinterland of Paris, that soft drawl of Simenon that people lose when they wish to be believed. Maigret stared a while at the telegram, then folded it and put it away. The stove's ash, the red wax, the careful hand, the name borrowed like an umbrella, all these were the manners of a man who had practiced vanishing. Yet vanishing is a style, and styles are habits, and habits leave prints that are wider than fingerprints. In the morning, he would send Lucas to the hiring offices near the freight yards. Men with neat hands who stamped papers often drifted there between jobs, and their umbrellas, like their names, changed owners with the weather. For now he allowed himself a final image, not of the man, but of the woman, kneeling beside the stove, the poker in her hand, watching the last word char and curl into nothing, the room breathing smoke that smelled faintly of violets, the rain praying at the window like useless counsel. When she stood, what had changed? A letter burned does not burn its command. It only warms the room a moment. He closed his eyes and saw the cafe's mirrors again, the way a door would open and the glass would swallow a figure and make him two. The city like doubles, 2 names, 2 stories, 2 lives balanced on a narrow stair. The fragments on his table were not yet a letter, but they were a direction, and directions in Paris are made of cafes more than of streets. He tamped his pipe, rose, and reached for his coat with the tired contentment of a man who had asked his questions for the day and taught them to wait. By late afternoon the sky had settled into a grey that was neither weather nor mood, only the city's natural colour when it grew tired of deciding. The café en rue de la Grange aux Belles carried that same indecision inside, mirrors that refused to commit to a single reflection, a zinc counter that looked clean until the light moved, a floor whose sawdust held secrets from earlier hours. Maigret stood in the doorway a moment longer than politeness required, letting the room take his measure. The regulars turned just enough to show they had noticed and returned to their cups. The waiter watched him in the mirror because it felt safer than watching him directly. Steam rose from a copper urn with the steady sigh of an old sleeper. Somewhere behind the counter, a radio whispered news of trains and markets, then faded into dance music so faint it might have been rain. He chose a table by the window not to see the street, but to let the street see him. The waiter approached with a towel over his arm and a look of weary intelligence one meets in those who have learned to count coins by the sound they make before they land. "A coffee," Maigret said, and the man nodded as though the order confirmed something he already believed. The cup arrived hot, dark as the coat of a wet horse. Its steam made the window sweat and thickened the line between inside and out. He did not ask questions at once. Questions in cafes had to be brewed like tea. They grew bitter if poured too strongly. He stirred his coffee without sugar and waited for the sound he knew would come, the low voices trying to be lower, the cough offered as a curtain, the exchange of glances that passed over his table like small birds. The café was a room of daily men and nightly women and vice versa, their arrangements practical, their alliances provisional. People came here not to be seen, but to guard the fiction of not being seen together. It was exactly the kind of room where a woman could sit with a man and leave no trace except the way her hand failed to find her cup when she reached for it. When the waiter refilled the water jug at the next table, Maigret asked, without lifting his eyes, if the coffee had improved since the night before last. It was an innocent arrow sent toward a target he could not see. The man paused, jug hovering. "The roast is the same," he said. "Some customers prefer it in silence." He moved to set down 2 saucers, then added in a voice so thin it seemed to come from the steam itself. There was a woman that night who preferred quiet, and a man who preferred it for her. Maigray's pipe lay forgotten in his pocket. He kept his hands still. "Describe the quiet," he said. The waiter glanced at the mirror as if it might correct him. She watched the door as if the door were late. He watched her as if she were early. They spoke softly. He asked if the rain had stopped. She said not yet. They paid separately, yet he counted both coins with his eyes. His name? In places like this, sir, names are ways of misplacing people. The man's voice carried no insolence, only a caution learned the hard way. But one of the boys from delivery called him Monsieur Perrin, because he left a parcel once with that name written across it. The parcel contained only paper, tied with lacings as neat as an office. Did he carry an umbrella? Of course he did, the waiter said, and this time a smile flickered, quick and almost pitying. Umbrellas and secrets come in together and leave together. He wiped a ring of moisture from the table, and after a pause added, "There is a woman who sits by the door in the mornings to sell lilies. In the afternoon she mends gloves for the shop 2 doors down. She saw them go. She sees everything that happens while she pretends to thread a needle blind." Maigret finished his coffee, paid, and left a coin that made the waiter glance at him properly for the first time. On the pavement outside the light had gone thin, as if the day were a photograph left too long in developer. The lily seller was where the waiter had promised, a narrow woman with sharp cheekbones and a shawl that might have been white once, or might believe it would be again. She sat on a small folding stool and stitched with a concentration that suggested she had resigned herself to mending the city 1 finger at a time. He bought a lily he had no need for and tucked the stem into his coat as if the flower were a note he meant to answer later. "You were here 2 nights ago," he said softly. "You saw a woman leave with a man who carried rain with him even when it had stopped." The needle paused at the cloth. The woman held it perfectly still, so that the thread quivered of its own mind. "I see many people," she said, "more than I care to remember." She bit the end of the thread and returned to her seam. But there are some who look at doors as if the world were waiting behind them with a whip. She was one. Where did they go? Not far. Around the corner, as if to be certain the café lost them. He spoke with his head inclined, the way men do when they want their words to enter a woman's ear without passing through the street. The seam tightened under her fingers. He gave her something small, a packet perhaps, and she held it the way women hold good handkerchiefs, with politeness that trembles. Then they walked toward the canal. He walked like a man accustomed to being followed and therefore never looked behind. She walked like someone who wanted to be a child again, but had forgotten the road. "Did you know her?" The woman shook her head. "I know types better than faces. She was the type who irons her fears in the morning and wears them under her dress. There are many such." Her eyes flicked to his lapel, to the lily that did not belong. "But she had one thing I do remember. On her wrist a small scar, not ugly, like something a spool might have done when it ran away." The description drew the scar in Maigray's mind so distinctly that he could smell again the morgue's carbolic and the faint wool of her coat. He thanked the woman, left another coin that the shawl swallowed with dignity, and crossed toward the canal. The air there felt different, made of water and rumour. Barges smelled of rope and the patience of journeys that never hurry because there is nowhere worth hurrying to. On the low bridge a group of boys leaned to watch their faces warp in the dark green below, laughed and hurried off when they found his eyes. A man selling roasted chestnuts under a blackened umbrella, another umbrella cracked at one rib, watched Maigret as intently as the water watched the sky. The inspector bought a paper cone, let the warmth creep into his hands, and asked whether there had been a gentleman here the night before last who counted steps as if afraid to waste any. The chestnut seller nodded toward the towpath. He came, he said, and he did not like the sound the bridge makes when one crosses it. He stood at the near end and waited for the woman to arrive. He would not meet her in the middle like a lover. He lifted a nut to his mouth and studied its steam. He spoke too carefully, like a man reciting a civics lesson. Then he sent her away and walked the other direction to make the picture different. Did he come alone? At first, the man said, but the kind of men who pretend to be alone are often accompanied by everything they fear. When he left, he turned his umbrella against the wind, though the wind was not that strong. Men do that when they need to feel the world press back. The canal offered a narrow bench, slick from earlier rain. Maigret sat, the paper cone warming his lap. He thought of the letter burned in the stove, of the words that survived, "Do not come any more. If it is learned, danger. Money, later." The café and the canal and the woman's scar had braided themselves into a single thread that led to a man who preferred the architecture of distance. He rose and followed the towpath toward Rue des Vinaigriers, not because he expected the man to be found there, but because landscapes remember footsteps longer than men do. By the time he returned to the café, the light had thickened into evening. Inside, the mirrors held more candles than tables. The room had become a mild version of itself, as if stripping down to essentials before the night's theatre began. The waiter approached without being summoned. "Your friend with the grey hat," he murmured, as if speaking of a relative whose existence everyone acknowledged but never invited to dinner. "He comes here early when it rains and late when it does not. He orders nothing that leaves a smell on his breath. His shoes do not squeak. Where does he sit?" "Where he can see both doors," the waiter said, "and where no one can see his hands." He pointed discreetly to a table angled against the mirror's edge. The chair was modestly pulled in, as chairs do when they remember the weight they held. On the table, nothing but an old wine list and a ring of moisture that did not belong to this evening. "Does he speak to anyone?" "To whoever believes they can forget him afterward," the waiter said. "Once he spoke to a man from the freight yards. They counted papers together as if they were beads. Another time to a priest who did not dress like one, and once to the lady who sells lilies. He returned her needle and thread. Courteous, you see. Dangerous men are often courteous. It is the one thing they can afford." Maigret looked around the room and saw only the common sorrow of people who had chosen to be public in private. He thanked the waiter, left, and stood again under the awning to watch the street. The evening traffic composed itself into its own weather. He saw the lily seller fold her stool and vanish like a lesson one tells oneself before sleep. He saw a man in a cap peer into the café and think better of entering. He saw a pair of lovers who were not lovers rehearse a separation with the precision of clerks exchanging documents. When at last he turned to go, he noticed a figure across the street, not hiding, but not presenting itself either. The hat was grey, the brim tilted just enough to keep the owner's eyes private. The umbrella hung from one hand like a polite weapon. The man appeared to be studying the evening for a detail that might betray it. He lit a cigarette with care, and, rather than smoke, held the lit match a moment longer than necessary, as though testing whether the flame would permit him to breathe. He took one step, then two, then retreated into a doorway where his outline merged with the geometry of doors. Maigret did not move, The street performed around them. A cart, a couple, a policeman who chose not to see what he could not explain. When he finally walked away, it was not toward the man, but toward the corner where the canal waited with its patient smell of iron and weeds. He knew better than to chase silhouettes through streets that had been designed to keep secrets cool. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he sent Lucas to the freight yards with instructions that sounded like a lullaby. Watch the men who wash their hands before leaving, not after. Watch the ones who keep an umbrella under a desk in good weather. Watch the signature that changes from one sheet to the next, as if its owner were trying on names like coats. He asked Janvier to return to the café at dawn when the mirrors told the truth, and the night's promises had become morning's explanations. And, for himself, he took the long route home because the walk would allow his thoughts to settle into pairs the way cutlery fits in a drawer without looking. As he crossed a small square, rain began to tap softly at his hat like a clerk asking permission. He did not open his umbrella. He liked the way the drops stitched the evening to the pavements, how the city smelled honest underwater. In his mind, the stove's ash and the cafe's steam and the canal's green drew together around a single absence, shaped like a man. He would see the face soon, not in a mirror, but in a mistake. Men who practice invisibility inevitably forget one small corner of themselves where the light can still land. He reached the river and watched the current carry a paper scrap toward the next bridge. It looked like a letter someone had forgotten to finish. He thought of Berthe kneeling by the stove and of the line that had survived the fire. Do not come any more. It was an instruction that explained everything except the human part, and that was the only part that mattered to him. He turned back toward the office with the feeling one gets when a door opens somewhere out of sight. Night had begun in earnest now. A gust lifted and laid the rain in a single sweep. At the corner, under a gas lamp that hummed like a low opinion, a shadow separated from the wall and moved with the exact economy of a man who disliked attention. The grey hat tilted just enough to deflect recognition. An umbrella rose like a courteous salute and vanished into an alley that smelled of wet coal. Maigret stood very still and drew once on his pipe, though it had gone cold. The city held its breath in that little alley, and the air around the gas lamp thickened to the colour of old brass. The step that followed sounded like a decision. The wind off the canal had a different weight that morning, a cold intent that scraped the last warmth from the stones. Paris had awakened to a thin sunlight that seemed painted rather than lived, a borrowed colour spread over roofs still wet from the night. Maigret watched the first tram clatter past the Quai des Orfèvres and felt the city resume its rituals, the hiss of water on cobbles, the smell of coffee rising from ground floors, the metallic whisper of newspaper stands unfolding. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt slightly rearranged, as though someone had tilted the city by a fraction of a degree. Reports waited on his desk like unpaid debts. Lucas's handwriting trailed into fatigue at the bottom of one page. Freight yard foreman confirm a temporary clerk named R. Perrin, hired 3 months, vanished 8 days ago, neat hand. Umbrella always at arm's reach, no address given, only a small pension house on Rue de l'Ourcq, paid weekly, 1 room, no forwarding notice. Maigret smoked and stared at the word vanished. The word pretended to be simple, but in Paris it rarely meant the same thing twice. Some men vanished into other jobs, others into drink, others into guilt, and some merely shed one name for another, walking the same streets unseen because they had learned the right angle of a hat, the right rhythm of footsteps. He left the office before noon, coat buttoned, hat pulled low. his shadow a companion rather than an outline. The pension house was easy to miss, a narrow door between a baker's shop and a stationer's window full of notebooks nobody bought. The hallway smelled of yeast and damp plaster. A woman answered his knock, her hair pinned with the economy of habit. She recognized authority before he spoke. "Monsieur Perrin?" she said, and her tone suggested the name had been waiting to be asked. "He's gone. Left the key on the table, said he was visiting family." "Did he have family?" She hesitated, smoothing her apron, though it was already smooth. "He said so, but I never saw letters. He liked order, paid exact. Never asked for more water in his jug. Smoked only in the evenings. You wouldn't have noticed him if he hadn't wanted you to." She frowned, as if the absence itself offended her. "He took everything, except the umbrella." The object leaned in the corner near the stair. Black silk, its ferrule cracked, one rib mended with fine wire. Maigret lifted it, felt the weight, the faint smell of tobacco clinging to the handle. "He forgot it?" The woman shook her head. "He left it standing like a man at attention. I think he wanted someone to remember him that way." He carried the umbrella out into the light. Rain threatened again. Paris never promised fairness. He opened it and saw, near the inner seam, 3 tiny punctures, needle marks that had no reason to exist. Between the folds a scrap of thread remained, violet in hue. He pocketed it and let the umbrella close with a sigh. At the corner cafe he ordered beer, not because he wanted it, but because sitting made observation easier. Through the window he watched the street's reflection more than the street itself. People moved like phrases, he read them for commas. Twice a man in a light overcoat passed, his walk deliberate, his face the sort memory refuses to store. The second time he paused to light a cigarette beneath the awning opposite. The wind blew just enough to lift the brim of his hat, and there it was, the tilt, the careful geometry of anonymity. Maigret waited until the man moved on, then rose and followed at a distance measured not in meters, but in indifference. The street spilled into the Boulevard de la Villette, noisy with carts and the smell of oil. The man crossed without haste, turned down a side street, and disappeared into the crowd near the metro. The inspector did not hurry. Pursuit belonged to men who wanted victory. He wanted understanding. Inside the metro the air was close, sour with damp wool and coal smoke. He saw the grey hat again, 2 carriages ahead, the umbrella carried upright like a staff of office. Passengers swayed together as the train jolted. Through the tunnel, faces merged and parted in the yellow light. At Jaurès, the man stepped off, merged into the flux of office clerks, and ascended toward the daylight where posters peeled from the walls. Maigret followed slowly, each step weighed by familiarity. On the street above, the man paused before a tobacconist's, looked in, then turned east toward the canal. He entered a building with a brass plate that read Société de Transport Frigorifique du Nord, a freight office. Maigret stopped at the opposite pavement, watching through the glass as the figure spoke to a clerk, handed over a packet of papers, and signed something in a ledger. When the man turned to leave, his face came briefly clear, heavy jaw, moustache trimmed to obedience, eyes that neither met nor fled. Later, inside the office, the clerk confirmed what the inspector already knew. "Monsieur Perrin," the man said, "brings us contracts to forward, always in order, never a complaint. But this time he seemed anxious. Asked if telegrams could be sent from here without record. I told him no. He smiled as though that was the answer he wanted." Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret laid the umbrella on his desk beside the violet thread. The fabric caught the lamplight like a bruise. "Violets," he murmured. The perfume at the crime scene, the scrap of ribbon near the stove, now the thread. All the same shade, a woman's trace running through a man's possession. He telephoned the prefecture, asked for Janvier. Check every tailor in the 10th arrondissement using violet thread in recent repairs. And look for bills signed Perrin or Robert. One of them will recognize the hand. By dusk, the rain had returned, harder now, full of purpose. Maigret walked home instead of taking the car, letting the city wash itself around him. The reflections in shop windows played tricks, his own outline dissolving into that of strangers. The umbrella under his arm felt like evidence of a thought rather than a thing. Halfway across the Pont de la Tournelle, he stopped. The river beneath looked restless, shouldering its way between walls built to contain it. He thought of Berthe Lambert, of her quiet obedience to someone else's fear, of the letter that had begged her absence, and the hand that had written it. The man with the umbrella might not have killed her out of anger. Some murders were born from tidiness, from the desire to fold a mistake out of existence. A barge horn sounded below, deep and lonely. The wind carried the smell of wet rope. He turned toward the embankment lights and resumed walking, slower now, pipe unlit, the city widening before him like a case refusing to close. Somewhere ahead, a man still carried another umbrella, identical but unstained, and beneath it walked the explanation to every question the rain kept asking. The Quai des Orfèvres had its own weather, an indoor climate of paper and tobacco, and the slow rain of newsprint dust that settled on shelves like a second law. When Maigret pushed open the glass door that afternoon, he felt it at once. The building's breath, the discreet hum of phones, the slap of carbon copies being peeled apart. Somewhere, a typewriter hammered with the vigor of someone who hoped to drown out doubt by striking it one letter at a time. The corridor's tiles remembered every footstep, every impatience. A clerk carrying a stack of files paused just enough to measure his expression, and then remembered a different errand. On his desk, envelopes lay in a tidy fan. The top one bore the smudged stamp of a cheap newspaper, the kind sold with cigarettes and impatience. He slit it with a thumbnail. Unidentified woman found in courtyard near Récollet. Witnesses report scream at 2 a.m. Police pursue jealous lover. The last line had the cheerful certainty of ignorance. He set the clipping aside and reached for the next. A telegram forwarded from Belleville. Lambert family alerted by landlady. Mother en route by morning train. He closed his eyes a moment. Mothers travelled with a silence around them that no platform announcement could cut through. The commissioner sent for him at once. The man's office was bright and dry in a way that suggested weather had been abolished there by decree. "You're attracting chatter," he said without preliminary, tapping the newspaper. "Better that we make the chatter ours. A tidy narrative. The umbrella man as jealous lover will do for now. People like their sins organized." He studied Maigret's face and softened his tone by a millimeter. "You have something better?" "Tidy narratives are the last thing this case has to offer," Maigret replied. He sat without being told to. The man with the umbrella is not jealous, he's organized. He carries fear like a folded letter. He prefers distance to drama. The fragments in the stove say as much. Do not come any more. Danger? Money later. This is not a crime of heat. It's a crime of temperature control. The commissioner's pen ticked against the blotter. Then we cool it before it boils in the street. Work faster. Put names to the man before names put themselves to us. He leaned back, studying the smoke cresting from Maigret's pipe as if it might spell an answer. "You're thinking business rather than romance." "I'm thinking dependence," Maigret said. of a woman working with her hands, stitching, mending, drawn into someone's order. A clerk who moves papers for men who don't like to be seen. A seal of wax chosen for privacy. A ledger written in an obedient hand. If she came to him asking for help, that help may have turned into a leash. And leashes, when pulled, often snap. "Find the hand that held it," the commissioner said. He tapped the paper again, lighter this time, as if reluctant to bruise the day. "And keep the papers from discovering another hand first." When Maigret returned to his office, Lucas was waiting with a stack of notes bound by string and a face that had mislaid its humour. "The tailors," he said. 3 in the 10th who still keep violet thread. One on Rue des Vinaigriers remembers repairing a black umbrella last month. A man with a voice from outside the city and a habit of weighing his words as if they were coins. Name? He signed R. Perrin on the chit, but the hand looks like it learned a different initial and only changed its hat. Maigret grunted softly. "Our man likes to be someone he could plausibly be, even if he never was. He doesn't invent, he borrows." Janvier came in with his notebook open. "And the freight offices? The same name turns up in temporary ledgers, Perrin moving invoices for small firms who don't want their clerks to see what arises from nowhere and goes somewhere else. He shows up, stabilizes the paper for a week, 2 at most, then evaporates. Paid in cash, owed nothing, responsible to no one. A man who passes through life as a useful rumour. Did anyone see him with a woman? One clerk thinks yes, not here, near the canal on a Sunday. He called her La Petite Courageuse, the little brave one, because she kept walking when the rain began, as if the weather had to be earned. Janvier's eyes flicked to the window. He says the man told her, "You must trust me," the way men do when they're about to take trust away. The autopsy report arrived like a cold hand. No bruising of struggle beyond the fall. A blow near the base of the skull consistent with contact against iron, stair edge, railing. No sign of strangulation, no poison, no child. The doctor's marginal note read, not unkindly, "The body does not protest the simple version." Maigret read it twice and knew that a simple version often stepped aside to let the real one pass unmolested. He smoked, then set the paper down. By late afternoon, the building had filled with voices that did not belong to the police. Journalists wore their curiosity like damp collars. One of them, a quick-eyed fellow with shoe leather polished to apology, cornered Maigret near the lift. "Is it true," he asked, "that the woman came to Paris from the provinces with only a sewing machine and a photograph?" He didn't wait for an answer. "And that she met a railway clerk who promised a job?" He smiled as if the case had agreed to be serialized in his paper at a franc a column. Maigret held the boy's gaze until the smile retired. "It is true that a woman died," he said. "It is true that we will not let your paper write her life for her." He closed the lift gate, rode up to records, and let the iron smell of shelving tame his temper. Files opened like rooms, each with a draft of a story someone had once chosen not to finish. He asked the clerk for temporary hires registered in the last year, who had drifted among freight offices for firms that used private seals for small stations, Saint-Martin, La Villette, Pantin, that fed men to Paris with the promise of invisibility. The clerk's pencil made soft weather on the index cards. Names blossomed and fell. The mother arrived in the evening, shawl pulled tight, skirt damp at the hem. She sat in a small room with a window too high to serve any purpose but light. When they showed her the effects, a handkerchief, the postcard, the watch that had stopped not at death, But a day earlier, she touched each object as if it might change its mind. "Berta worked hard," she said, and her voice was the same voice that calls children home at dusk. She sent money when she could. She wrote less. In the last letter, she said only that Paris was larger than she was. The woman's eyes found Maigray's and held them with the gravity of people who own nothing but their gaze. If a man promised her something, she would have believed it until it killed her. He walked her to the door, stood with her a moment in the vestibule where the building's warmth thinned into corridor chill. "We will not let a promise be the last word," he said. She nodded, as if such words had been invented to make departures possible. When he returned to his office, twilight had pressed its fingerprints on the window. The city outside had turned the color of pewter, dampened by breath. The phone rang once, a delicate sound, and he lifted it. A voice he recognized without naming, Mado from the café on Rue de la Lappe, said quietly, "Your grey hat came in this afternoon, not to me, to a man who sells stamps from the bottom of a drawer and letters from the top, the kind of man who knows which addresses never expect an answer." "What did he post?" "A small packet, sealed red. The clerk said lion wax." He laughed as if he liked coincidences. A pause. "He asked the price for a letter to Nemours. He didn't send it, but he liked knowing the price. Nemours, Seine et Marne, where the accent makes Paris sound like a cousin one only visits for weddings and funerals. The hinterland in his voice, the one the tailor had heard beneath the borrowed name. A line drew itself on the map in his head, from the Forgotten Courtyard to the canal, to the freight offices, to a drawer of stamps, and out toward a town that taught men to be patient with fields and precise with figures. He stood, reached for his coat, then stopped. Something insisted on being considered first, the violet thread trapped in the umbrella's seam. He spread it on paper, and under the lamp it bruised into certainty. The glove-mender's shawl had carried the same shade. The gloves 2 doors from the café were stitched in that colour. The woman on the stool had seen him pass twice, had watched him treat the door as a colleague. He sent Janvier back to the street with a description sharpened by daylight, not only the grey hat and the umbrella, but the courtesy that arrives a second too early, the hand that avoids leaving warmth on a glass. "Ask who buys gloves for hands that never lift," he said. "Ask which parcels leave through side doors with receipts too neat. Ask whether a man has been returning needles to women he never quite looked at." Night deepened its shoulders against the window. The building grew quieter the way a large animal quiets, without truly sleeping. Somewhere a door closed as carefully as it could. Somewhere a clerk coughed as if trying out the sound of guilt to see whether it fit. Maigret remained at his desk and, as he sometimes did, allowed himself to imagine the man in the grey hat answering questions no one had yet asked him. The voice would be level, the sentences short. He would explain that he had tried to do the correct thing, to keep the woman away, to solve the matter with paper and distance. He might even say that the staircase was unfortunate. Men of order call accidents unfortunate. It protects them from the effort of sorrow. The river's breath crept through the casement. He realized he had not lit his pipe for an hour. The city outside had abandoned precision and given itself to rumor. From the press office, a junior reporter's laughter rang out and was throttled by senior silence. A train called out from the Gare de l'Est like a beast who had found its way again. The phone rang a second time. He lifted it, and this voice was different, wary but urgent, the sound of a man pinching the wire as if he hoped to stop the words from travelling too far. "I will not give my name," the caller said, "but I have something to put down and I don't know where else to put it." The man you are looking for attends early mass at Saint-Martin when it rains. He smokes outside afterward and speaks little. He sends money sometimes through a box, not through a priest. He believes God is accounting. Tomorrow? Maigret asked. Tomorrow? Or the next? The voice said. A beat of breath. But when he comes, he always arrives before the bell because he dislikes following. The click at the end sounded like a door that had decided to remain closed. He replaced the receiver and stood very still. The room had grown smaller without moving. He looked down at the violet thread and felt, not triumph, but the subtle shift of a case passing from one season to another. The ground-level mystery, blood on stone, the unclaimed shoe, the stove ash that tried to be dust, was giving way to the city's larger weather. The draught that ran from office to alley to church pew, the bureaucracies of hope and fear that turned private mistakes into public catastrophes. He thought of the commissioner's instruction to keep things tidy for the papers and almost smiled. Straight lines did not suit Paris. It preferred its truths with corners. He put on his coat. In the corridor, his footsteps sounded like a sentence, choosing its verbs carefully. At the building's door, he paused, feeling the river through the night, before he saw it. Gaslight hummed across the street. A boy ran past carrying a bundle of unsold editions that would tomorrow wrap fish. The city accepted its own recyclings without complaint. He set off toward the Pont Saint-Michel, not to walk home, not to think, only to let the quays make their old argument that everything returns to water-wise balance if given time. The wind had shifted. It brought the smell of wet rope again, and somewhere close by, bells counted the hour with a patience that refused to be hurried. He imagined the church at Saint-Martin, the stone cool even in summer, the dark wood of the pews that taught backs to be humble. A man could confess there without opening his mouth if he believed the accounting had begun elsewhere. On the parapet, a poster clung in strips to the wall, advertising a dance 3 nights past. The tatters fluttered in a rhythm not unlike breath. Maigret touched the stone, cool and indifferent, and felt the case looking past him into a deeper room. He turned the collar of his coat up and began to walk again, quietly, as if someone were already at the other end of the street waiting for him to arrive, no sooner and no later than necessary. Morning returned with a half-light that made Paris look like it had forgotten itself. The river hid beneath a sheet of vapour. Bridges began and ended in whiteness. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the lamps were still burning, small islands of resolve in a building that preferred dusk. Maigret entered quietly, his coat stippled with the mist. The room smelled of ink, cold pipe ash, and the damp wool of policemen who had stood too long outside churches. Janvier was waiting beside the radiator, collar up, holding the latest report. He was there, he said without needing to name the place. Saint-Martin. Rain started before the first bell. He came early, as promised. Grey hat, umbrella hooked on his arm, prayed without moving his lips. When the candles guttered, he slipped out through the side door and went toward the canal. I followed as far as Rue des Vinaigrettes. Then the fog thickened. Maigret took the paper from him but didn't read it. The fog is kind to men like him, he said. It lets them believe they're chosen. He warmed his hands a moment, then began the slow walk to the window. Beyond the glass, the river's surface was invisible, but he could feel its weight, steady, indifferent. The city breathed differently on mornings like this, softer, suspicious of its own outlines. Somewhere a bell rang once, unsure whether it meant to summon or dismiss. At the corner cafe, he found the same waiter wiping the same counter. The man looked up with tired curiosity. "Your Monsieur Perrin came by last night," he said. didn't drink, read the paper twice as if it would change between lines, left a few coins under the saucer, and said something about trains. What about trains? That they run even when nobody is waiting? The waiter shrugged. Sounded like philosophy or an apology. Outside, the fog had folded itself thicker. Maigret walked slowly, pipe unlit, until the shapes of buildings dissolved into suggestion. The world had been reduced to sound, the soft hiss of tires, the drip of gutters, his own footsteps keeping patient time. The fog erased distance. It made proximity the only truth. Somewhere close, he heard the faint scrape of an umbrella ferrule against cobble. He stopped, listened, but the sound dissolved into the larger breathing of the city. He crossed the canal bridge and descended to the towpath. The air there was colder, freighted with the metallic tang of water. Barges loomed like sleeping animals, their ropes creaking softly. He walked until the outline of the church tower emerged ghostly above the warehouses. A single figure stood at the edge of the quay, hat tilted, looking toward the invisible horizon. When Maigret drew nearer, the man turned just enough to acknowledge the approach, a courtesy, not a welcome. "I thought confession was for souls," Maigret said quietly. The man smiled faintly. "And yet here you are." His voice carried that trace of the provinces again, softened by years of pretending otherwise. "I suppose you followed me for the comfort of repetition." "You burn letters better than you write them," Maigret replied. A pause, then a short laugh, tired rather than amused. "You've been thorough." "Not enough. There's still the question of how a man who avoids storms found himself beneath one." The man leaned on the railing, eyes on the white blur where the river should be. Because storms travel faster than explanations. They stood a while, the fog moving around them like a living thing. Finally, Maigret said, "Her name was Berthe Lambert. She believed you when you said, 'Trust me.' She waited until it killed her." "She was kind," the man said. "Too kind. I tried to spare her. But she came anyway." He turned toward Maigret, his face emerging by degrees from the mist, ordinary, tired, lined by the geometry of regret. "I never struck her. She fell. I swear it." Maigret's voice was low. "Men swear to what they remember, not to what happened." The man exhaled, a shape of breath that vanished instantly. "I meant to send her away with money. Enough to start again somewhere no one knew either of us. But she thought money was forgiveness. She came to remind me what it cost." He looked down at his hands, gloveless, careful. "When she slipped, it was like the world decided. I didn't even reach for her. Perhaps I should have, but I was too afraid of being seen doing something human." For a long time, neither spoke. Somewhere in the fog, a barge bell rang, 3 slow notes, solemn as prayer. Maigret studied the man's face, the stillness of it. "You've hidden well," he said. "Names, papers, cities. But you can't hide from weight. It travels with you, even lighter than air." "I'm tired of carrying it," the man whispered. "Then set it down properly." The man nodded once, almost grateful. "Will it matter? To her, I mean?" "It always matters," Maigret said. "Not for the dead, but for the living who remember them wrong." They began the walk back toward the street. The fog thickened until the church vanished behind them. When they reached the first gas lamp, the man stopped, closed his umbrella, and looked at it with mild curiosity. "Funny thing," he said, "I never liked the rain." He handed it to Maigret, as if surrendering a name. By noon, the fog began to lift. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Janvier waited by the door. Did he come quietly? As quietly as he lived, Maigret said. He placed the umbrella on the desk and sat heavily. "Send a telegram to Nemours. There's a mother who deserves to stop waiting. Outside, sunlight broke through in hesitant stripes, laying gold on the wet pavements. From the river came the low murmur of traffic resuming, as if the city had simply paused to listen to its own conscience. Maigret drew his pipe from his pocket, lit it, and let the first curl of smoke climb into the air. In the silence that followed, he thought of Bertha's small room, the dress unfinished on the sewing machine, the letter half burned and half remembered. The fog would return, as it always did, but for now the air was clear enough to see the truth without pity. The church on the edge of the canal had a chill that did not belong to weather. Even when the sun managed its thin geometry through the high windows, the stone held the memory of colder seasons. Maigret entered without ceremony, hat in hand, pipe in his pocket, as if he had stepped into a witness rather than a sanctuary. The nave smelled of wax and damp wood. A woman lit a candle, and then two more, as though accuracy were a form of love. Somewhere a floorboard reported the weight of a parishioner who knew which pew would forgive his knees. He had not planned to meet the man here again. He had expected the confession to be written on paper and countersigned by duty. But the messenger, a sacristan with a face like a folded letter, had come to the quay with a single sentence. Monsieur asks if the inspector will hear him before the priest does. It was not piety, it was sequence. There are men who cannot speak except in the order they believe the world should keep. In a side chapel where the light fell aslant, the grey hat lay on the bench beside a pair of gloveless hands. The umbrella had been surrendered the day before, but its memory had the weight of an object still leaned against the wall. The man rose when Maigret approached, and then, uncertain of the etiquette of guilt, sat again. For a moment the inspector watched the flame of a votive candle and considered the small industry of its burning, the way a little column of smoke makes an argument with darkness all by itself. He said nothing. Silence breeds truer speech than questions do. The man began without being asked, his voice flat, the provinces whispering in the vowels. He gave a name that would likely not survive verification. Roland Perrin today, Robert tomorrow, something else in Nemours. Names had been the wardrobe of his life. He described work that existed between other men's work, arranging papers, smoothing receipts, presenting the appearance of order so that disorder could move through the city with a clerk's signature for disguise. He did it well. Men paid for that level of quiet. He met Bertha, he said, not in romance but in utility. She mended gloves for a shop by the café and took in piecework for sleeves and hems. A rainstorm drove him under the awning where she sat with her sewing case. A few words about the weather became a question about addresses, then a curiosity about the going rates for careful hands. He hired her to stitch a set of sample covers for packets he sent through the freight offices. Nothing illegal, he insisted. Merely the careful concealment of arrangements that preferred not to be explained. She worked quickly for the first month, and returned his envelopes folded as precisely as his sentences. He kept her like a secret one tells oneself. When she began to ask softer questions about the men whose names appeared on documents twice and the sums that moved without furniture to justify them, he told her half-truths. Half-truths kept the peace, but the city has a way of instructing even the modestly curious, and Bertha learned, through rumour and the café's mirrors, that her sewing had been recruited by a system she did not respect. She tried to refuse further work. He agreed, politely, even gratefully. And then the letters began. Not accusations, appeals. La peur me tient, monsieur, I am afraid. I must leave Paris soon. If you can help me make the rent for the month, I will go and you will not hear from me again. He sent a little money. She sent another letter, this time without address, left at the glove shop under a spool of thread. Not enough. He saw her twice at the canal and once in the cafe. The last time she looked tired, like someone who had carried a suitcase in her mind for too long. He promised a sum that would square every ledger. He asked her not to come to his lodging, not to come to his work, not to come in general. He wrote the instruction and then, in a moment of panic, burned the second half of his words because the shape of them had begun to look like law. On the night that ended in the courtyard, he had left the cafe first and waited under a porch until the hour grew vulnerable. He walked with her as far as the alley gate behind Rue des Récollets. It had rained. The steps were a black ladder. He told her to return to her room and pack a small bag. He would bring the money in the morning, enough to put her on a train with distance added to its price. She refused. She wanted to leave that night before fear could grow back. He said there are trains even fear cannot catch. She laughed then, quietly, without music, and told him she had already learned the worst thing about hope. It waits until one's back is turned. He reached into his coat and produced a packet, small, pinned shut with violet thread. She opened it. The sum inside was less than his promise, more than her need, exactly sufficient for a quarrel. She argued without raising her voice. He answered with the tone of men who expect reason to be relieved at their arrival. She stepped backward, perhaps to flee him, perhaps to keep the money and the conversation from touching. Her heel met the edge of the stair. The shoe turned. The old stone did what old stone does. He remembered the sound without knowing he had heard it. He stooped to describe the fall with a precision that embarrassed him. The temple striking the angle. The quickness with which silence arrives. The stubborn habit of the body to keep breathing even when circumstances withdraw permission. He said he waited not because he wanted her to live or die, but because waiting was the only skill he had in crisis. When the courtyard told him no one had seen them, he did what he had always done. Tidied. He retrieved paper, burned what named him, hid the umbrella because objects remember. He left by the alley and allowed the rain to perform its temporary absolution. He did not run. He rarely did. He considered sending the remainder of the money anyway, to Nemours or nowhere, but arithmetic offered no absolution either. The words exhausted themselves and left the man breathing as though he had been running in place. Across the chapel, a child asked his mother whether saints are policemen in heaven. The mother kissed his hair by way of doctrinal correction. Maigret watched the way the candlelight settled on the man's face and thought again of temperature. This was not a hot crime. It had the chill of a warehouse aisle, of papers squared on a desk, of a man who had built a life from the discipline of never being surprised by himself. You could have called for help, Maigret said. You could have stood in that courtyard with your fear and a neighbour's lamp and let the city see you try to be human. The man folded his hands. I have never been good at the public gesture. And yet here you, Maigret said, and softened the edge in his voice by a degree he himself hardly heard. Telling your story before someone writes it for you, that is a kind of gesture. They spoke then of names and addresses and the littlest details that police require to make a confession tangle correctly with law. The pension house, the stationer, the tailor's chit, the freight ledger entries signed with a hand that had forgotten its first initial. He offered them all. No argument, no bargaining, no attempt at a prettier story. When he hesitated, it was never to invent, only to choose the least dishonest route across memory. At last the sacristan coughed discreetly near the door. Afternoon had thinned to the few hour that parish clocks prefer when the city seems briefly undecided about its own noise. The man rose and looked at the side aisle where a confessional waited with its small architecture of forgiveness. He made a half-turn as if to step toward it, then stopped and turned back to Maigret with the surprise of someone hearing his own intention from outside. "It would be theatrical," he said, almost apologetically. "Justice first," Maigret replied. "Theatre after." They left the church together, neither leading, moving side by side like men acquainted by profession rather than feeling. The air outside held the clean smell certain days keep for themselves after rain. Along the canal, a barge horn sounded a thoughtful note. The city opened its fingers again around them. At the corner, Janvier appeared from the fog's last thinning with the neutral face policeman practice when the ending is known but not yet signed. The man did not flinch, did not ask for time, did not beg any right he had not already spent. He simply nodded once, as one clerk to another, and surrendered the rest of his hours. Back at the quay, the confession was set down under formal headings, each paragraph a room with doors on both ends. The man read it once and corrected a word, contre instead of sir, because precision is a form of respect long after it is useful. He signed carefully, and then beneath the signature he drew a small line to steady the paper, a habit learned at a desk where slips are punished. He asked if he might send a single letter. Maigret weighed the request and agreed, on the condition that its text be spoken aloud. It was brief, a sentence to a brother in Namur, no repentance, only logistics, the disposition of a box, the explanation that an absence would replace him. He did not mention Bertha's name. Perhaps he believed it was no longer his to write. When it was done and the door had closed behind him, an odd quiet settled in the room. It was not satisfaction. It was the sound a case makes when it stands up and walks to its own shelf. Maigret tamped his pipe and failed to light it twice. At the third match, the tobacco answered. Smoke rose in a column that wavered like a thought that can afford to waver at last. He pictured the Forgotten Courtyard again, the staircase washed, the lamplight steadier now, the caretaker carrying his broom as if carrying time, and he felt, as he often did, after confessions that fit too neatly, an unease that would not find a chair, because the truth remained short of comfort. A woman had trusted a man trained to believe that tidy solutions are the same as mercies. A city had provided corridors in which such training could pass for virtue, and Maigret, who understood both the woman's poverty and the man's economy of fear, could do nothing with that understanding but give it the correct shape in a report. He let the feeling sit and did not try to name it. Names make some things smaller. Toward evening, the mother from Belleville returned. She did not ask for details. She asked for the body to be released when the papers allowed, and for directions to the church where the candles were cheap and the stone did not draft. Maigret accompanied her part way down the corridor, then stopped and watched her go, the shawl dark against the corridor's pale light. People always looked smaller walking away from the quay, perhaps because they had to carry what they had not brought in. In the courtyard below, a policeman shook rain from his cape. The lamps along the river lifted their weak gold. The city's noise resumed its usual argument with itself. Maigret sat at his desk, wrote a line in his notebook that he did not intend anyone else to read, and closed it. The pipe went out. He let it. Some smokes are meant to fail. He stood, put on his coat, and moved to the window. The Seine, visible again beneath the evening, looked darker than before, as if it had learned something from the day and would keep it. Tomorrow he would return to the lodging-house once more, not for evidence, but because endings need their beginnings to believe them. He would stand at the staircase and let the air decide what, if anything, remained unsaid. The city, when it gave up a secret, always left a little behind as interest. He turned from the glass and reached for his hat. The night had work for other men now, clerks of law, reporters of appetite, priests of consolation. For himself, he wanted only a walk that returned him to a kitchen where Madame Maigret would set down a bowl without asking questions she already knew the answers to. The simplest mercy Paris allowed was soup. He locked the drawer, clicked off the lamp, and listened a moment to the building's old heart. Then he stepped into the corridor, where footsteps went forward because they had to. Rain returned to Paris like a repetition the city had agreed to recite without conviction. The drops were light but persistent, too small to soak, too steady to forget. The Seine moved beneath the bridges as if it carried something heavier than water. Time, perhaps, or memory, softened to liquid. Maigret walked with his hands deep in his pockets, his pipe cold between his teeth, the brim of his hat tipped low against the drizzle. The case was finished in the way cases are finished, paper-filed, statements signed, a man confined to walls that would never learn his name properly. And yet the air refused to close around it. Each corner of the city seemed to whisper the story back to itself. At the corner cafe, someone still pointed to the window where the woman once sat. The stool by the door kept an accidental vigil, and the waiter, when he wiped the counter, wiped the same invisible ring of her coffee cup. Maigret's feet found the old path without planning. He crossed Boulevard de Magenta, turned down Rue des Récollets, and reached the narrow lane behind the lodging house. The gate creaked the way it always had. Some places never learn new sounds. Inside, the courtyard waited. Cleaner now, the stones scrubbed, the lamplight steady. The staircase, that unwilling witness, stood in perfect order. The rain traced its lines gently, rinsing the last trace of blood that had been gone for weeks but not forgotten. The caretaker appeared from his little room, cap in hand. "Inspector," he said, with a stiffness that tried to be reverence. "They say the papers will stop writing about her now. It's better, I think. The tenants sleep easier?" Maigret nodded. "Do you?" The man gave a small laugh, embarrassed. "I dream of mopping. Always the same staircase, always the same stain, but each night it's in a different place." He left the man to his nerves and moved toward the steps. Water gathered in the grooves, trembling before deciding which way to fall. He thought of Berthe Lambert as she had been described. Quiet, neat, the kind of person who tried to keep her existence within acceptable margins. And yet the city, indifferent to margins, had folded her into itself, turning her into one more secret among thousands. He stood on the landing where her door had been sealed. Through the thin wood came the familiar domestic silence, another tenant now, another life beginning over the same air. The smell of starch and boiled vegetables leaked into the corridor, the smell of endurance. He closed his eyes. Behind the silence, he could almost hear the faint hum of a sewing machine, the steady pulse of work that had once kept fear at bay. Below, the courtyard shimmered in the lamp's reflection, and for a moment the city seemed transparent. He saw the pattern of it all, the cafe and the canal, the freight yards and the church, each connected by invisible strings of habit and despair. A woman with good hands and bad luck, a man too timid to be cruel and too frightened to be kind. They had played their parts with the precision of those who believe there is still time to rehearse. From the street came the rumble of a tram, the world continuing its indifference. Maigret leaned against the railing, lit his pipe, and let the smoke curl upward, until it mingled with the mist. The taste was bitter at first, then familiar. "She trusted," he murmured, though no one was near enough to hear. And he tidied. It was not judgment, only definition. He descended slowly. At the bottom step, he paused, his reflection trembling in the puddles, like a question that had not been erased but rewritten. He could almost imagine her standing where he now stood, coat damp, eyes uncertain, one hand on the banister, listening for footsteps she hoped would mean deliverance. Every case ended here, on some staircase between fear and accident, between what people meant to do and what they could not stop from happening. As he turned to leave, the caretaker called after him. "Monsieur Maigret, do you think she forgave him?" The inspector looked up through the drizzle, the glow of the lamp soft on his face. "I don't think she had time to decide," he said quietly. "But time decides for everyone in the end." He stepped out into the street. Paris was grey and infinite again, the fog at the edges of vision blurring carriages and pedestrians into one slow-moving thought. Somewhere nearby, a street organ played a tune without melody, the kind that fills silence rather than breaks it. Maigret walked without hurry, coat heavy with rain, pipe gone out once more. At the next corner he stopped to watch the reflection of the lamplight in a puddle. A leaf floated through it, circling briefly before vanishing down a drain. It was enough. The city had accepted what it had been given, and that acceptance was its form of closure. He turned toward the river. The lights along the embankment wavered in the mist, gold dissolving into grey. The Seine moved with its old, calm patience, carrying away whatever people dropped into it, letters, regrets, names, umbrellas. The inspector paused to watch a barge slide beneath the bridge, a single lamp glowing on its deck like a star too tired to climb the sky. When he finally walked on, his thoughts were light enough to fit back into silence. Tomorrow there would be another case, another set of stairs, another quiet face looking up at him with questions that already knew their answers. He did not need to hurry. Paris, faithful in its sorrows, would wait. He crossed the bridge, and the fog swallowed his shape until he was only another moving shadow beside the river. The last echo of a story told softly enough for the city to believe it was its own.